So for half a century, only one of the speakers of the House and no presidents pro tem of the Senate came from the South. And very few of the Supreme Court justices during that half century were Southerners. So very much the scale tilts toward the North much. And then lastly, James and I talked about the unresolved contradictions of America after the constitutional period, but up to the Civil War, that had never been resolved. But these issues are resolved after the Civil War. The first was a question of whether this new republic would be, which is born into a world of kings and emperors and tyrants, how could it survive when a Republican form of government is not the norm by any means? It was really an experiment in government in 1776. And the founding fathers feared if America would actually survive. And they knew that most republics throughout history, look in ancient Greece or Rome, were overthrown by revolutions or collapsed into anarchy or dictatorship. And many Northerners feared that this would happen with the Civil War. Some Americans that were alive in 1860 had twice seen French republics fall to these forces, and they thought the same could happen to them. So this is why Lincoln at Gettysburg described the war as the great testing of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people would survive or perish from the earth. And the Civil War showed that it could. So that's really good. The second unresolved issue from the Revolutionary era was slavery. Jefferson, I think, described slavery as holding a wolf by the ears. You do not like to do it, but you dare not stop for 1 second lest you be ripped apart. And the founding fathers, many of them wanted to resolve this issue, but they knew that with getting the southern states on board, it was impossible. Well, this is finally resolved. So Lincoln speaks of a new birth of freedom, and he refers to this problem unresolved by the Revolution of 1776. Antebellum America had been fond of boasting that their land of liberty is a beacon of light, but for 4 million people, it was not a beacon of light. It was monstrous injustice, as Lincoln describes it. But with all of these constitutional amendments, it at least legally tries to destroy this monster, but it takes a very long time afterwards to cause it to come to an end. Hey everyone, want to take a short break in this episode on our narrative on the Civil War. I want to mention a way how you can help support this show, and you can do so by saving big with a great new product from a company called Candid. Candid basically takes all of the misery out of adult orthodontia. There's millions of people at any given time in the United States who have wire braces, and there are many, many millions more who should be wearing retainers and aren't and need a tooth straightening solution. Well, Candid is a company that makes it possible to get tooth straightening without ever having to visit an orthodontist, without ever having to leave your home, and to get it all done much more cheaply and in a fraction of the time of conventional orthodontia. The way it works is that Candid sends a modeling kit to your home so you can take impressions of your teeth. After you send back your impressions with some photos of your teeth, a network of orthodontists reviews your case and provides you with a 3D preview of what your treatment will look like. After you receive your 3D preview, it's up to you if you want to go forward or not with a tooth aligner treatment plan. And when you get your treatment plan, it results in straighter and brighter teeth in an average of 6 months and can cost thousands of dollars less than braces. And again, no office visits are needed. Everything is delivered to your home. You can take advantage of Candid's risk-free modeling kit guarantee. And when you use my dedicated link, candidcode.com/unplugged, you'll save 25% off your modeling kit. That's candidcode.com/unplugged to get 25% off the price of your modeling kit. candidcode.com/unplugged. All right. So, any thoughts on political changes?
Yeah, a few things on the government becoming more centralized. That's certainly true. And one of the things that people often quote, I see this or read this or hear it in lectures, is that prior to the Civil War, people spoke of the United States in the plural, meaning they would say the United States are an amazing people, or the United States are increasing their industrial production. Whereas after the Civil War, it changed to is. And that's a huge change. It's just a minor little linguistic thing, maybe in some people's eyes, but it speaks a lot. After the war, the United States is increasing the size of its army or something like that. So that's one thing that's I think is very telling and significant. So I agree with you completely about the political power, Scott, between Northerners and Southerners. It's just amazing how much the United States government was under the control of Southerners for the first, I don't know, what is it, 1788 to 1861 or so, about 72 years or so. And not only that, but a lot of the Northern presidents were dough faces. They were completely bought and paid for by the South. I shouldn't say bought and paid for, but ideologically they were definitely on the South side. And then after the war, it's a complete flip-flop. I would just point out that you did have one Southern president between Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson, that 100 years or so that you mentioned. It was Woodrow Wilson, although, I mean, yes, he was. Right. Yeah, Wilson was governor of New Jersey, and he was the president of Princeton University, but he grew up in the South and lived there most of his childhood and his teen years, at least. And so he was very much a Southerner in his outlook. He actually segregated the White House and the executive branch, whereas it had been more or less integrated before that. So Wilson's an exception to the rule. But yeah, and it's interesting too to notice that since Lyndon Johnson, we've had quite a few Southern presidents. It's like the balance is tipping back, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it was just a phase, but we had Lyndon Johnson, of course. We had Jimmy Carter. We had the first George Bush, even though he wasn't born in the South. He lived most of his adult life in Texas, and then George W. Bush grew up in Texas, and he's mostly a lifelong Texas, even though he has New England roots. And then you had Bill Clinton as well. So I don't know if we're tipping back. Our last two presidents have been Northerners, so who knows what's going on nowadays. But anyway, yeah, it's that shift was so radical of power from South to North. It's just almost mind-boggling to think of, but not surprising when you consider that the South lost the war. Mm-hmm. And one other thing that the Civil War settled that I would add to the excellent points that you brought up is that it settled the issue of secession. Secession, when most Americans think about secession, they think about the South and the Civil War, but there had actually been several times prior to that, going all the way back to the beginning of the American Republic, where one state or one region had threatened to secede. The South had threatened a few times, but even the North had threatened to secede in individual states. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was my first job out of college, I was working in South Carolina, just an hour north of Charleston, and I was super into the Civil War at that time. And in my office, I had this replica of that Charleston Mercury headline that said that the Union is dissolved, and I put that on my wall just for fun. And in this office where I worked, I was an engineer. Most of the engineers in the office were native South Carolinians or other Southerners, but we had quite a few people from Maine there too who had moved down, and they moved from a paper mill in Maine, and they were working there, and then they intended to retire in South Carolina. And I had one guy come up to me and say, "You know what? You might want to take that sign down. You might offend some of these people from Maine." And so I went to my boss, who was from Maine, and I said, "Norm, does that offend you?" And he goes, "Oh, man, are you kidding? You don't know how many times Maine threatened to secede from the Union." I'd never even heard of that at the time, so that was kind of funny. But secession was once and for all settled. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case in 1869, Texas versus White, and in this, the court held, among other things, it was not just about this, but one of the things the court ruled was that the Constitution did not permit states to unilaterally secede from the United States, and that the ordinances of secession and all the acts of the legislatures within seceding states intended to give effect to such ordinances were absolutely null. So that settled the issue, even though when we know that you still hear a lot of talk about secession from time to time. There was talk about Texas. I mean, just talk. It's
or
a bunch of
California, Cal exit.
And now it's California, yeah. Right? But
sorry, guys. This marriage is for life. Once you're in, you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave.
Good quote.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, that's all I have to add there.
All right. Well, one thing too is military change. We've mentioned a lot in this series how it seemed that people are dying needlessly because tactics cooked up by, take a drink, Napoleon, 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, are still being used ineffectively. But these are brilliant military minds who are engaged in the conflict, and of course they are going to adapt to the situation. So what changes as a result of the Civil War? The first one is that logistics dependent on modern transportation become more important than Napoleonic-style fancy maneuvers. I mean, we've talked in the early 19th century, Napoleonic maneuvers where you outflank an enemy force, you strike them on their side, you strike behind them, you move your forces quickly over land are important. But the time and space of the Civil War changes because railroads now enable swift movement of forces, of logistics. Steamboats allow this as well. I mean, yeah, you're constrained to narrow, vulnerable corridors, but you can move much more quickly. And on the sea, steam power, ironclads change transport and combat there as well. The telegraph allows rapid communication between armies and your headquarters. So it's almost like your chief of command can be there right on the front lines. So combat is still usually waged with skirmishes on rural battlefields, but there is still room for strategic maneuvers and triumphs of strategic maneuvers like Sherman's March to the Sea, which is a classic Napoleonic move. But this depends on an enemy's unwillingness to entrench. Entrenching becomes much more common as the war goes on too. And that's the second point, that entrenchment to counter long-range firearms is another feature. So towards the end of the war, especially with in defense of static targets like the battles of Cold Harbor, Vicksburg, you have trench networks that get more and more sophisticated, and they foreshadow World War I. Interestingly enough, these battles aren't immediately learned in Europe. So the Austro-Prussian War or the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, you still have these Napoleonic-style maneuvers. But in America, entrenching becomes a means to encounter long-range firearms. And commanders learn that sometimes you just have to sit on your haunches a long time because a charge isn't going to accomplish anything. You might slaughter your men unless you have another diversionary tactic. And it seems like this isn't really solved until you have aerial combat that can deal with entrenching. And then you have tanks as well that can handle these large open spaces. And warfare eventually evolves. But James and I were discussing, it seems like the Civil War, the technology to kill works, but the technology to protect you doesn't. So technology seems to be only your enemy and not your friend in the Civil War. It's miserable. And then the third point, too, is that there are advances in naval warfare with the importance of ironclads. So after putting iron plating on wooden hulls, and then you have ships that are built up specifically as ironclads, naval vessels are almost indestructible, at least compared to their wooden counterparts. And with a rotating turret, you don't need as many cannon on a single vessel because you don't have to move an entire ship in order to fire on your enemy. So you can keep firing on a retreating or advancing craft when you're on the move. And then there's just some miscellaneous technology, too, I'll throw in. We mentioned dog tags because in the past, soldiers would write letters or whatever, put them in their pocket. So if they were killed on the battlefield, people knew who they were. But that becomes part of it as well. Okay, and then just a couple of other things with military technology. You have the importance of a nation's size and productivity is better appreciated. As we're moving into the thick of an industrial age, total industrial output is seen as what can ultimately win a war, not how well you outflank an enemy on the field. Your total industrial war effort of being able to adequately supply your troops when you're dealing on the scale of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and understanding the importance of your military machine is better appreciated. In World War I, World War II, we see this in terms of strategy, where taking out a factory becomes equally as important as taking out actual soldiers, because if you can't feed or equip them, who cares? This is not the Revolutionary War where a bunch of hard scrabble rebels can basically live off the land. I mean, those days are, except for limited periods of time, like the Sherman's March to the Sea, for a